Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 49, Inferno 2. The cheers of the thousands of people crowded into the stadium were nearly deafening as the competitors for the Chunin exams walked into the arena. People from all across the elemental nations cheering as one for the next generation of shinobi. Many of the teenagers down there now could quite well become the next Sannin, or even Kage. The great part was that nobody knew. They had all come for one thing, to see some exciting fights and cheer on their respective Chunin hopefuls. Although a good majority were also cheering for the people they had made bets on. They were there from all walks of life, high-class nobles, farmers that had scraped together the Rio, civilian and shinobi alike. There were so many people there that it was understandable that the three people sitting up on the roof of the stadium went completely unnoticed. It did help that they were completely invisible to the naked eye thanks to a strategic use of the Boidogakure no Jutsu, and were crouched over in a way that would make any Byakugan user simply believe they were shinobi that had decided to take a seat high up. Although a few ANBU had passed by, giving the spot a second glance as they swore they heard the sounds of eating. You know, eating dango like that isn't very discreet. Naruto's voice was a whisper, so he didn't alert the very attentive guards that were no doubt highly strung due to all the extra security Konoha would have to put in place during the exams. When the fights themselves actually began they would be somewhat distracted, but until then subtlety was key, although Fu didn't seem to get that message. She happily ate her invisible dango, unconcerned by the slight noise she made. If anything gave them away it would more likely be the smell. As if to exemplify that very point, a kunoichi with vibrant purple hair done up in a spiky ponytail suddenly appeared on the roof in a rather over-the-top shunshin that had far too many leaves than were necessary. She was looking around in confusion, occasionally taking a sniff of the air and glancing in their direction. At one point it seemed she was actually about to come over, but an ANBU appeared shortly after and politely asked her to leave the restricted area. A collective sigh of relief passed between the three kids. Being found in a shinobi village using a jutsu obviously designed for stealth was not generally a good thing. Okay, I think that's enough dango for you. Fu's shout in indignation as Naruto quickly tossed the food off the side of the arena wall was quickly muffled as Haku placed a hand over her mouth. The ice wielder suddenly felt incredibly lucky that he couldn't see the withering look that he could practically feel Fu giving him. Below them came a shout of surprise followed by an even louder cry of indignation as the dango landed on some poor unassuming spectator. I thought you said that the jutsu it smells as well. Fu spoke in a hushed but still very agitated tone as she glared at where she thought Naruto was sitting. The invisible blonde simply shrugged, although he quickly realized that such an action was pointless when nobody could see it. It should, it did in Kumogakure. Haku perked up at that. He had been incredibly intrigued when Naruto had shown him the jutsu and told him it required excellent chakra control. However, unlike Naruto, Haku could not keep it up indefinitely without the Pretapath's abilities, although short stints shouldn't have been impossible. They hadn't yet told him the story of how Naruto came up with it, or even why a monk would need a technique like that. Kumogakure? Naruto just patted him on the shoulder as another ANBU raced past, the signal for them to be quiet until he left. Long story, we'll tell you some other time. Haku just nodded conceding, humming his acknowledgement considering Naruto couldn't see him, or at least could only see his chakra. It didn't seem to matter though as there was another approving roar from the assembled crowds below them. It seemed the trio had missed something as only two shinobi remained in the arena along with the proctor, a lazy-looking man chewing on a senbon. That isn't very good for the senbon. Fu just nudged Haku and shushed him, even as the dark-haired boy was frowning over the treatment of his favorite weapon. A hush descended over the crowd as a Hokage stood up. To his left sat the Kazekage, his identity given away by the the wide-brimmed hat bearing the symbol of his nation. To his right, slightly further away than the Kazekage, was Owanoki, the third Tsuchikage. There had been quite a stir when news that an IWA shinobi had passed to the last stage of the Chunin exams in Konoha. Nobody had expected the Tsuchikage to come. Finally, on the other side of the Tsuchikage was a man Naruto was all too familiar with, the enormous form of the Raikage himself. The refraction is probably weaker considering how wide I've had to make the field. Although Naruto had to admit that when he wasn't holding the layer of chakra around his body like a skin-tight suit, it made it easier to control its shape. Then again, that was offset by how difficult it was to simply hold it at that distance. It was taking nearly all his concentration to keep the three invisible. He could barely focus on the matches. Shush! Again Fu quietened the two boys as the Hokage stood up, clearing his throat loud enough for the entire stadium to hear him, no doubt using chakra to amplify his voice. Naruto smiled gently as he listened to a voice he hadn't heard in years. He had genuinely missed his Gigi. Even if he couldn't have the life he had wanted, the friends he had wanted, the Hokage had always at least done what he thought was right for Naruto. He may not have always been there, but that was certainly more than anybody else besides the Ichiraku family could profess to have done for him. In his reminiscence, Naruto actually missed what the Sandaime had said in his speech, and before he knew it, two of the genin were out at the center of the arena, eyeing one another up. "A Hyuga, this should be interesting." Fu's voice didn't really express that interest, devolving into her usual toneless drawl, but if Naruto could see her he would have noticed that slight analytical glint enter her eyes. During the Kiri Civil War she hadn't exactly made friends with many of the rebels, but she had garnered an appreciation for sparring against bloodline users. Their unique and often unpredictable abilities really fed that part of her that yearned to learn more, and considering her early life it was unsurprising she had a healthy curiosity regarding fighting styles. The Hyuga, after all, were well known for their distinctive and effective taijutsu style as well as their dojutsu. They possessed the Byakugan, correct? Fu made a slight humming noise to acknowledge Haku, but Naruto could tell she hadn't even looked around. The Hyuga looked like Naruto remembered the clan to be, a haughty and stiff posture, long brown hair, traditional clothing, and the memorable pale white eyes. His opponent was less recognizable with his short greasy black hair and deep maroon eyes, his forehead protector loudly and clearly marking him as an Iwagakure shinobi. However, the Konoha genin didn't seem interested in that. He seemed to alternate between shooting scathing glares at the single Kumonin that had made it to the final round and sneering at his opponent. "You should just give up, Iwagakure shinobi, fate has already declared me the winner here." Naruto raised an eyebrow at the genin's tone. It was one thing to be confident about one's abilities, it was another thing entirely to speak in absolutes like that. "He is rather arrogant, isn't he?" Naruto couldn't help but agree with Haku on that one, and the IWA genin seemed to mirror their opinions. "Screw you, tree hugger, I don't care that you come from some fancy-ass clan or whatever. I scrapped my way here from the streets and you're just another obstacle in my way." The young boy settled back into a rather rigid stance as a cocky smirk settled on his face. Niji didn't look all that impressed with the boy's bravado though, and simply settled for leaning back into the distinctive first stance of the jokin. A faint smile crept onto Naruto's face at the stance as a fond memory passed through his mind. "What do you want?" A tall man with an overly rigid posture stood frozen, mid-step, in a stance that was a part of a dance-like movement as beautiful as it was deadly when executed against a real opponent. Nearby a young blonde boy with his eyes squinted in a horrendous impersonation of the Fire Temple's head monk sat, stars in his hidden eyes as he peered up at the taller man looking down contemptuously at him. "Your taijutsu style is really cool." The man's already upturned face managed to twist into a look of even greater indignation as he gracefully slipped out of the low stance he had maintained rigidly. "This is no mere taijutsu style, boy, it is the jokin, the personal style of the Hyuga clan, and it is by no means cool. His voice carried the contempt he felt rather well, but Naruto simply quirked his head to one side in confusion. The name struck at a memory of his. Looking up, he felt a wave of familiarity overcome him as he noticed the man's pale eyes. "Hey! Aren't they a clan from Konoha?" The man sneered again, looking around as if for an exit so he could leave the irritating child alone. "So why are you here at the temple? Did you have to leave like me?" Looking back at the small blonde, the man noticed he was no longer imitating Chikako, obviously too distracted to remember to narrow his eyes. It revealed the light purple, ringed eyes that had been talked about in legends for hundreds of years as just that, legends. Right now they gleamed with an innocent curiosity and something else, excitement. In a way. Naruto blinked in confusion. For a moment he thought he had found somebody he could relate to, being forced to leave their homes despite not wanting to. "Huh, what do you mean?" The man simply turned, figuring if he couldn't leave the child or make him leave, both of which were against the code the temple taught, he could simply ignore him. "Hey!" The man winced at the young boy's irritatingly high-pitched cry of indignation. "Don't ignore me. I just want to understand Tebeo." The man swiveled on a foot, none of his movements anything but the epitome of grace and poise, as he had always been taught. After all, the clan with the greatest jujutsu in the world had to act the part, although hearing of the powers this young child displayed already put less credence into that belief. "Understand? You wish to understand?" Briefly the man's look of disgust turned into something reminiscent of a snarl, but years of indoctrination and training couldn't be broken so easily, and almost instantly it morphed back into a superior sneer. "You're just a child, how could you possibly hope to understand me?" He reached up to his brow, swiftly removing the leather headband he wore there in a smooth movement, revealing something imprinted on his forehead. It was two horizontal lines ending in small hooks bordering a left-facing manji symbol, each spoke also ending in a small hook. The entire tattoo-like design was done in a pale green, and despite its innocent appearance Naruto could see the chakra faintly pulsing through it. "What's that?" The man glared at the young boy for a moment, but the blonde seemed to simply ignore the look, obviously rather used to them considering what he contained. The man didn't particularly care that the boy housed the Kyuubi, he had been living at the temple since before the attack, but he still looked down on him with the same contempt the Hyuga did for everybody else. This mark represents the cage we branch family members are forced to live in, having them simply because we were not deigned to be born into the main family. Naruto blinked in confusion, his young 8-year-old mind struggling to comprehend everything that was being said. He didn't really understand the talk about branch and main families. After all, the concept of a family being divided in any way was almost incomprehensible to the young orphan. "So, it's some kind of seal?" Naruto didn't really need to ask, since learning of his burden and his search to free Sora beginning, he had seen plenty of them, he knew at least how to recognize them. "Yes. It is a seal." At this point the man was actually wondering why he was still even talking to this boy. In his time at the temple, as per an agreement between the Hyuga clan and the Fire Daimyo, he had rarely spoken to anybody. Most of the monks simply went about their business, neither ignoring him nor making any special effort to talk to him. Yet this little boy, the age of a first-year academy student, had managed to get him to speak more than he had in the past year. "Then why don't you just remove it?" At that the man just huffed in irritation, as if the very idea of it was beneath him as well as ludicrous. "And you believe it to be so easy?" He didn't even ask it as a question, from his mouth it sounded more like an insult to Naruto's intelligence. "Well, why wouldn't it be?" Without any warning Naruto suddenly stepped forward, reaching out and poking the man in the forehead, directly over the faint manji symbol there. The man, in his surprise at not only being approached, but actually touched by the boy, couldn't react in time to stop him. However, before the instinctual berating could cross his lips, his pale eyes widened as a sudden lance of pain shot through his skull. He recoiled in shock, clutching at his forehead in pain as Naruto fell backwards, tripping over his own feet as the man pushed him back. What did you do?" The man practically growled it out as he clutched at his forehead despite the pain already dissipating. His trained instincts screamed at him not to show this kind of weakness, as it was unbefitting of a Hyuga, yet for some reason he just couldn't find it in himself to care as much anymore. "A what?" Naruto sat on the ground, rubbing at his elbow that he had banged on the floor as he gazed up at the man in confusion. You called that seal a cage, right? All cages can be unlocked. So, I just got rid of it. I thought you would be happy. The young blonde seemed genuinely confused at why the man suddenly seemed so angry with him. He had only been trying to help after all. However, as the man's shock subsided and Naruto's words fully struck him, his pale eyes once again widened. The throb was gone, the ever-present, but almost unnoticeable throb that served as a reminder of the Branch family's subservience was gone. You got rid of it. The man blinked very slowly, his mind struggling to believe that such a thing was even possible. It shouldn't be, everything he had been taught said otherwise. How? Naruto stood up again as the Hyuga did the same, rippled purple meeting pale white. Will all seals need chakra to work, right? That's what the books I read said. Yours took chakra away from you, so I just stopped it from doing that and took out the chakra already in it. The answer was quite rational, but coming from the young blonde, with his high-pitched, immature voice, it just sounded surreal. Hey, I don't even know your name anyway. Again, the Hyuga blinked slowly. That was right, he had failed to introduce himself, which was another etiquette he had looked over and found himself not caring about anymore. My name is Rohani Hyuga. The young blonde just grinned, the seriousness as well as the consequences of what he just did completely passing over his immature head. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Rohani simply stared at the boy for a few seconds before tentatively placing a hand up to his forehead, a single tear valiantly fighting to fall down his cheeks. Naruto remembered that fondly. It had been Rohani who had given him the inspiration for his Kaminari no Mai, using the fast and precise finger strikes from the jokin to instead attack pressure points. He remembered the Hyuga's surprise at how quickly Naruto picked up the various stances for the style. It helped that Naruto perfectly remembered each step after he had done it correctly once. The man hadn't even meant to teach the boy. After all, it was forbidden for a Hyuga to teach anybody outside the clan their techniques. Naruto had simply started picking them up one day after watching him. Ow, that has to hurt. Naruto snapped out of his reverie at the sound of Haku's voice, blinking in surprise when he noticed he had completely zoned out through the match. The IWA boy lay on the ground, badly bruised and bearing what appeared to be burn marks, while the Hyuga looked none the worse for wear, not even bothering to look at his defeated opponent in favor of glaring at the Kumo Genin. It couldn't have been a long match, but judging by the awed and cheering reaction from the crowd, it had been eventful. It was definitely interesting. I had been taught that only the main house members of the Hyuga could perform the kaiten. Fu's emotionless summation had Naruto looking down at the floor. He noticed the distinctive 2-meter radius indentation that looked like they had been burned into the ground. Being a branch member, Rohani was unable to perform the move, but he had described it to Naruto, the hint of envy in his voice unmistakable. From the state of the arena, Naruto could at least take a guess at what had happened. There was a long line of loose earth stretching from the IWA Genin's body to the edge of the kaiten's mark. It was obviously the remains of an earth dragon that had been unable to breach the Hyuga's impenetrable defense. Naruto had always wondered why anyone believed the defense was impenetrable. All you needed was something matching the rotations of the chakra dome, but in the opposite direction. That would be enough to throw the user off balance, probably leading to their own technique harming them. However, even as Naruto thought these, the next two contestants were brought out, two people that brought a smile to his face. Naruto knelt down on the soft ground, smiling sadly as stared solemnly at the two small raised plaques on the ground. Each bore the name of somebody who would always be dear to him, Tochi and Ayamichirako. They were buried near the outskirts of the cemetery, near to the training ground that also bore the shinobi memorial. It had taken him a while to find them, their names lost among the myriad of others buried in the very same place. The cemetery was quiet. He hadn't passed anybody else on the way here, but he had noticed more than a few flowers placed on the graves. Along that line his hands lit up in red and blue flames as he clasped them together. When he opened them again, he held two identical flowers. They looked like roses, but they were completely white, as if somebody had taken a flower and bleached it of all color. He thought it was appropriate given the circumstances. Gentle he placed them down on the plaques before leaving his hand resting over their names as tears began to well in his eyes. I'm so sorry Tucci, it was my fault. He sighed heavily as his body hunched forward, wiping away the tears before they could fall on the simple bronze plates. If I had just... He sighed again, not entirely sure what he wanted to say anyway. Maybe if he had never known them, maybe if he had shied away from their kindness, then they might not have died. He shook his head sadly. He just couldn't imagine his life without them, without Iam's warm smiles and Tucci's jovial laugh. Damn it, I told you we were lost. He sniffed back any tears that were still clinging to his face, and looked up, noticing that he was no longer alone in the cemetery. Would you quiet down, we're in a graveyard. The blonde frowned for a moment as he wiped his eyes. He could have sworn he recognized that voice. There's nobody here anyway, now stop trying to change the subject. Two girls came into view, one with long brown hair hanging down her back like a veil, and the other with sandy blonde hair tied back into 4 distinctive ponytails. I'm not. Baki-sensei said that it was the training ground with the memorial stone. When we asked that weird jounin with the mask, he pointed us this way. Naruto's frown deepened, recognizing the girls or not. He thought speaking so loudly in a place of mourning was disrespectful. Well, then you must have misinterpreted him. Naruto coughed into his hand, a mildly irritated expression on his face. He went completely unnoticed by the two girls though as they continued to bicker between themselves. He just pointed. How do I misinterpret that? Naruto coughed a little louder, yet his efforts seemed futile as the girls didn't even seem to notice. I don't know, but if anybody could find a way it would be you, fangirl. Again, Naruto coughed, more forcefully this time, and once again the noise seemed to bounce off some invisible, intangible barrier between him and the girls as they didn't notice a thing. What did you call me? Naruto had finally had enough. He was simply glad that there was nobody else in the cemetery to be disturbed. People in mourning tended not to be the most reasonable or rational people, especially shinobi. He slammed his shikuju down on the ground, and despite the loose soil it made a sharp, clear tone that sounded throughout the area like he had struck metal. Immediately both girls stopped shouting at each other and clutched their ears in pain. The sound only lasted for a split second though, and they quickly recovered. Are you two finished? Despite his young age, Naruto had long ago learned how to give his voice a commanding edge. It was something he picked up from Chikaku. The man could be jovial and playful one moment and serious or commanding the next. Both girls turned towards him slowly, already looking at the ground sheepishly, expecting to look up and see a jounin. However, they were not expecting a young blonde boy in monk garb bearing a shikuju, a very familiar-looking blonde monk. Naruto-sensei? Naruto? Naruto raised an eyebrow at the two before realization of his own set in. It had been a few years, but the defining features were still there. After all, his memory was perfect, and despite growing taller, their hair getting longer, and the new outfits, they still appeared to be the same two girls he had met all those years ago. Although he certainly could have done without hearing the sensei title again, it brought up painful memories of Shizuku. Matsuri? Temari? Both girls' eyes lit up before simultaneously both their expressions twisted into a frown as they faced one another. How do you know Naruto-sensei? How do you know Naruto? Naruto just blinked at the odd synchronization between the two before taking a step back as they both repeated the action, although now they were both glaring at him. How do you know fangirl? How do you know Matsuri? Temari turned to the younger girl, glaring at her for the name before returning her intense gaze to Naruto, the young blonde suddenly feeling uncomfortable with two irritated girls staring him down. It actually took him surprisingly little time to explain it to them, that he had met both of them during his stay in Sunagakure those years ago, and had in some way helped both of them with training. By the end the girls just seemed shocked that they both had met Naruto, yet neither had known about the other's relationship with him. He had moved them away from the cemetery, towards the training grounds, so they wouldn't disturb anybody else. So wait. Temari looked across at her teammate confusedly. Naruto is the reason you advanced so quickly in the academy? Matsuri immediately looked indignant. She often found people questioning her abilities due to her age, and she didn't need that from her teammate. However, she glanced at Naruto, and a hint of red entered her cheeks, making her meekly lower the hand she had raised in protest. Technically, Temari was right. You should give Matsuri more credit. I only showed her basic techniques. She was the one who learned them. The younger girl blushed at that. She was used to people congratulating her on her nearly prodigious skill, but to hear it from the one who trained her was something else. Temari just smirked knowingly at the girl, crossing her arms under her chest. So, the little prodigy had help, huh? Matsuri simply crossed her own arms over, looking annoyed again, the blush abated from her cheeks. Can still beat you in a fight, fangirl. Temari's smirk turned into a scowl as she reached for the large black battle fan on her back. For a moment Naruto thought they were going to fight right there. Bring it on then, Matsu-chan. At that the younger girl scowled as well, reaching for the kunai in her pouch, filling her hand with them. Ahem. At this point Naruto was just annoyed. They may have left the cemetery, but they were still close, and these two were about to fight it out over something as inane as this. Immediately both girls turned back to Naruto, blushing slightly in embarrassment as they realized they weren't alone. Sorry Naruto-sensei. Sorry Naruto. Naruto just sighed before smiling softly. These two, like Sora, had been some of his earliest friends, even if it was just teaching them things. He couldn't stay mad at them, in part due to the fact he found it hard to get mad at anybody. So, what have you two been up to in the last few years? He smiled softly but snapped out of his memories as the call to begin fighting rang out through the arena. He didn't want to miss this. When he had left Tsunagakure, Temari had been a fledgling wind user, while Matsuri was just beginning to grasp basic chakra exercises. However, from what he was seeing they had advanced greatly in that time, more than he would have thought. Temari opened by unfolding her fan completely, obviously taking Matsuri seriously from the get-go. On the other hand, Matsuri seemed rather unconcerned but still had her muscles tensed to move. From what he had heard from them, she was usually the victor in their spars. Without any delay Temari swung her fan, releasing an enormous bout of wind that Naruto could clearly see with his eyes. The gust contained many smaller blades within it, sharp enough to cause debilitating damage, but small enough for it not to be fatal if it struck. It didn't seem to matter though, as before the deadly winds could reach her, Matsuri tensed before disappearing with a small cloud of dust at her feet. Naruto raised a brow as he spotted her racing across the arena, ducking and weaving at such speed Temari seemed to struggle to keep up. He could clearly see the chakra she was using to enhance her movements, on her feet to provide traction, in her muscles to quicken their contractions, and in her joints for reinforcement. It was somewhat similar to how Tsunade strengthened her body, but on a much simpler scale. Instead of trying to focus in on her, Temari swung her fan in a large arc, covering much of that side of the arena in her dangerous winds. That forced Matsuri up into the air, which was exactly what Temari wanted. She used the opportunity to create a powerful updraft, further launching the smaller girl up and into the sky. However, before anything else could be done, Matsuri surprised everybody, apparently even Temari given her shocked expression, by suddenly launching something from her hand. It was small, but to the shinobi it was obviously a juyu, a small blunted dart attached to a long length of wire. However, what they couldn't see, and Naruto could, was the thin layer of wind chakra coating it, allowing it to dig deeply into the ground. Matsuri pulled on her end of the rope, allowing her to reach the floor again, and as soon as her feet met the ground she was off again, a blur to the untrained eye. It made Naruto smile to see her use what he had taught her so well and advance it as she had. The fight didn't last too much longer. Temari was exhausting herself with her widespread and frequent jutsu, while Matsuri was able to use the minimum chakra to simply enhance her movements. Neither were chakra powerhouses, but when it came to a war of attrition, Matsuri would be the clear-cut winner. Sure enough, after 10 minutes of this back and forth between the two, Temari made a mistake, not putting enough chakra into one of her wind jutsu. Matsuri was just about able to power through the weak winds, connecting with a powerful blow to the jaw that had Temari on her back, unable to continue. The crowd cheered heartily, It hadn't been the most exciting of matches, but it was always worthwhile to see the up-and-coming generation show of what they knew. There was also the mystery of what Matsuri might show in the next round of the fights. After all, she had managed to keep many of her skills hidden like a true ninja. However, as loud as they were, the crowd's cheers became nearly deafening as the next two opponents walked out onto the arena. Naruto quickly recognized the first as the Uchiha that he had briefly met in Wave, while the other was a stocky, dark-skinned Kumo genin. Both settled into their respective stances, not a word spoken between them, but a cocky smirk on both their faces. However, before the match could even begin, Naruto frowned. He felt the familiar tug as foreign chakra tried to invade his system, only to be passively absorbed by his Preta path. He wasn't sure what everybody else was seeing, but soon much of the non-shinobi crowd had fallen into a deep slumber. One by one, members of the crowd not affected by the powerful genjutsu stood up, confused by what was going on. Then chaos erupted from the ground. Chapter 50, Inferno 3. There was barely a second of warning before the floor of the arena suddenly exploded outward in a dangerous hail of rocks and stone. The jounin and chunin of the arena, as well as some of the genin, lucid thanks to the efforts of their comrades, managed to react in time to save the civilians from being injured. Hundreds of barriers of all kinds lit the scene up in an array of colors, from water encampment jutsu to rock domes, and even one or two wind walls that shredded any incoming rocks into a fine, harmless powder. However, any more reprieve for the leaf shinobi was asking too much, as only moments later a veritable army of enemy ninja rushed out of the newly formed tunnel emerging from the ground. Based on the explosions and sounds of fighting emanating from elsewhere, this was not the only place these tunnels had opened. There was only one village with enough highly trained earth jutsu practitioners to effectively use this entrance strategy, and sure enough, the rock-on-rock insignia of Iwagakure gleamed proudly on each and every headband. Naruto? Fu blinked when she noticed that she was fully visible again, as were Haku and Naruto, not that any shinobi would pay attention to them with all the fighting that had erupted. The blonde was just standing there, his Tsujigasa gone, and his long blonde hair swaying slightly in the breeze from atop the arena wall. His ringed eyes slowly roamed across the village, taking in the shinobi leaping about, some protecting civilians, others fighting. Some were mere blurs broken only by the occasional clash of steel on steel as kunai met in a beautiful and dangerous flurry of metal. Go. Fu stood up, confused at Naruto's whisper of a command. She noticed that his eyes weren't squinted, and she could clearly see his steely eyes, hardened into an expression she had never seen on him before. Go, please, stop the fighting where you can. I'm going to need a moment for this. Fu hesitated for a moment, taking a look around at the fighting herself for a moment. She had no feelings for these people, she didn't care for them personally, there was no reason for her to intervene. However, one look at the determined expression on her friend's face erased all her doubts, and she simply gave a firm nod before dashing off. Naruto-san? Haku remained by the blonde's side, looking at him uncertainly. He didn't have the privilege of knowing him as long as Fu had, but the sheer stony will emanating from him was nearly palpable. His hands were slightly tightened around his shikuju, turning the knuckles slightly white, and yet when the blonde turned to face Haku, his eyes changed, becoming compassionate. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, Haku. I know you don't like fighting. Haku wasn't sure what to say to that, and his face betrayed this, flickering through more than a few emotions before settling on confusion. He had never been given a choice before, not like this. With Zabuza, it was simply following whatever order his master gave unconditionally. He knew now that Naruto wanted him to fight, to help him see to it that these fights were stopped, but he didn't have to. All right. Haku's face shifted into one he had adopted many times before, a blank and completely emotionless slate, as he gave a curt nod, much the same as Fu's, and leapt from the arena wall. He would help Naruto, not because he was told to, not because those were his orders, but because he wanted to help out his first friend. There was also a small part of him that wanted to see an end to the needless violence just as much as the monk did. Naruto took in a deep breath as he stood there, just breathing in and out, focusing his chakra, feeling it flow through his coils, through the pathways that littered his body. He locked it in, not letting even a drop of it escape through his tenketsu as he allowed it to grow inside him, welling up, filling him until he felt the ends of his fingers begin to burn slightly. Then, all at once, he released it, snapping his eyes open to reveal two steel orbs. All around the village ninja that were running or fighting paused for a moment as a small tremor traveled through the ground. Many thought nothing of it, putting it off as a particularly strong earth jutsu or maybe a powerful exploding tag. However, a few moments later their eyes were drawn to the ground as they saw it begin to shift and move beneath them. First little grains of sand began to rise up, making a few shinobi just watch in surprise, then more and more earth began to slowly shift along the ground. At this point a majority of the shinobi had paused what they were doing, watching in stark amazement as the now loosened earth continued to congregate into one point. Slowly but surely, it began to rise up beneath Naruto's feet, lifting him higher and higher into the air on an enormous pillar of sand. All of the Suna shinobi there, including the Kage himself, looked up in horror as they recognized what was going on, but even they had never seen it on this scale before. Temari stood transfixed, trying to peer up and see the small speck of a figure atop the growing pillar of earth. Gaara. Her weak voice barely registered to the frozen shinobi around her, however, if sight before them had them pausing that was nothing compared to what came next. An enormous pressure suddenly descended on the village as the weight of Naruto's chakra was unleashed, weighing down on the shinobi like an actual physical presence. Many found their breaths catching as even from this distance they could see it. Stop this. The powerful voice, amplified by chakra, sounded throughout the entire village, sparing nobody's ears. He was just a silhouette with the sky behind him, his travel cloak billowing in the wind and his shikuju in one hand. The sharper-eyed among the shinobi could even spot the horns of his headband and his ponytail. However, all of them could see the faintly glowing ringed eyes that somehow seemed to be staring at the entire village all at once. Do you not see what you are doing? Only silence met his rhetorical question, the silence of an entire village staring as one towards the mysterious figure atop the pillar of sand. This fighting, killing, don't you see how pointless it all is? Despite the strength and power behind his voice, the hint of desperation and pleading was still there. He didn't want to just tell his message, he genuinely wanted them to understand him. You fight and kill here today, tearing families apart, killing brothers, fathers, daughters and wives, ripping friend from friend, but for what? The silence was deafening, there wasn't even the sound of kunai clashing anymore as everybody listened to the impassioned speech. What then? Their families, friends, loved ones will declare revenge on you, killing you to avenge those they lost. Then your loved ones will do the exact same thing in one pointless, self-destructing cycle of hatred. Naruto took in a deep breath as he drank in the oppressive silence, knowing full well the eyes of the village were on him right now. If you just drop your weapons and walk away, you can put an end to it. There doesn't need to be mourning when this is all over. Those of you who do this out of revenge know how it feels to lose somebody precious. Does inflicting that feeling on somebody else, somebody innocent of all this bloodshed, somehow lessen your own loss? The emotion behind Naruto's words were evident. He had seen it all before in Mizu no Kuni, felt it himself when he was staring into the eyes of the Mizukage. He had not felt relieved at the man's death, his sadness over Shizuku's death had not been relieved, he only felt hollow and sickened at what he had done out of rage. Please, it is up to you all to put a stop to this meaningless cycle of loss and suffering. His words rang out amongst the assembled shinobi, striking a chord with those who had indeed understood the bitter pain of loss in their lifetimes. Silence reigned for a few seconds as everybody simply absorbed the monk's words, nobody moving. However, the worst happened when one shinobi, it didn't really matter what village he was from, chose to use the sudden halt to launch a surprise attack at his enemies. It was like a dam had burst. Before Naruto's very eyes he saw the entire village once again descend into fighting. Glinting metal flew through the air, followed closely by boulders and fireballs alike, the jutsu being fired indiscriminately. Naruto could only stare wide-eyed as the village of his birth fell into anarchy, his words forgotten like a fleeting memory. It was as if right now the fight was no longer about winning or losing, just fighting for the sake of fighting. Do they love combat so much they don't even want to consider an alternative? The young monk asked himself, not sure what to feel from what he saw. Slowly his head lowered, his blonde tresses shadowing his eyes as his hands tightened into fists that actually managed to draw blood, the precious red liquid falling lazily onto the sand below him. Stop. The shinobi, Konoha and Iwa alike, couldn't have been less prepared. If anybody stood a chance it would have been the Sunanin, but even they could not escape. The ground literally dissolved around their feet, springing up like it was a living creature and swiftly wrapping up every single mobile person in the village in a tightening cocoon of sand. The shinobi struggled, but it was useless. Naruto's sand had caught them in a vice-like grip. Brute strength would do nothing for them as the sand could contract as much as it needed to, and even as they struggled their chakra was slowly being siphoned off, sustaining the sand itself. Naruto didn't even have to consciously guide it. The grains moved of their own will, simply seeking out anything with even a moderate amount of chakra and latching on as a cohesive unit. Naruto would have to thank Shikaku extra hard later on, but for now he focused on making sure that every single shinobi was captured. No favoritism would be shown to Konoha. However, before his sand could reach the Kage booth, not that Naruto had any misconceptions he could restrain any of them, the entire stand they were in burst into a noxious black smoke. When it cleared, a massive cube of a barrier had appeared around that entire rooftop, all four Kage trapped inside, although the image was distorted. Unfortunately for Naruto, he didn't have time to focus on that. This entire time he had been reaching out through the moisture in the air that had lessened significantly with the sudden presence of the sand. He detected a monstrous spike in chakra from the far side of the village, a foul, oppressive chakra he recognized all too well. It seemed Rashi was not Iwagakure's only Jinchuriki, and based on what Naruto knew it had to be either the Gobi or Rokobi. Naruto wasn't entirely sure if he could fight a Jinchuriki, especially one with a bijou that powerful, while maintaining the connection with his sand. However, the damage a Jinchuriki could do to the village, even one that only had moderate control over their tenant, was catastrophic. Luckily for him though, he sensed another presence rapidly sprinting towards the Jinchuriki, and had to contain a small smile as he felt fu near the foreign Jinchuriki. He trusted in his friend, she was very strong, and unless Kumo was a part of all this, and that turned out to be Karabi, which Naruto found unlikely, she would have the stronger bijou. With that in mind, Naruto headed off toward the flaming purple cube that marked where the 5 Kage had been imprisoned. He may not have been taking sides in this conflict, but he would be damned if he let anything happen to the one remaining link to the good memories of his childhood he had left. Fo touched down on the ground without so much as a whisper, her soft sandals patting her drop. Even so, the lumbering brute of a man she had closed in on managed to sense her, turning his visored head to observe her coldly. He was a massive man, possibly twice the height Fo was, with a dark, plated, red armor covering his body, occasionally venting a blast of scalding steam. Over that he wore a light gray kimono top. The look was finished by the wide-brimmed Tsujigasa hat, the same color and material as his amour that just about hid the Iwagakure headband he wore and cast his eyes into an eerie shadow. Who are you? You do not bear the mark of Konoha, or Iwa. Fo felt uncomfortable standing in the man's presence. Beneath his stoic facade burned a deep hatred that was almost visible as a thin veil of noxious red chakra. It leaked off of him and into the air like the steam from his suit. It reminded Fo of the times she was forced to control her own bijou. The intense anger she had to control and fight back with an air of apathy was immense. She did the same now, setting her features into an emotionless mask as she stood up, her eyes beginning to pick apart what she could of the man, which was, admittedly, very little. I am neither. The giant of a man simply huffed loudly, continuing his march further into the village, completely uncaring of the shinobi cocooned in sand all around them. They worried Fo because if it came to a fight then she would have to watch out for them. Fights between Jinchuriki were always messy. She could only hope the man would show the same control because there were Iwagakure ninja in the sand as well. I can't let you hurt anybody, I promised Naruto. The man stopped, his metal boots clanking on the floor as he laboriously turned to her, his cold gray eyes simply piercing into her. If you stand in my way, little girl, I will not hesitate to crush you. Fu's only response was to drop back into her taijutsu stance, beginning her own process of dredging up her bijuu's chakra. Her eyes almost widened in surprise when she felt how easy it seemed all of a sudden. She had faced many types of opponents in her life, her cruel captors in Takigakure, the unconcerned grace of Naruto, the bubbly yet hard-to-hit Shizuku, the variety of bloodline users in Mizu no Kuni. However, none of them seemed as intimidating as the brute before her. He was like an indomitable steel wall. He just had to be there, and his mere presence seemed daunting. It wasn't just the armor. She had defeated plenty of opponents that thought they could protect themselves from a shinobi with a few layers of metal. He simply had an air about him, as if she could see the blood of all the enemies he had defeated in the red of his armor. Like Naruto, he radiated a certain shroud of pure authority. Something told the mint-haired Jinchuriki that this man had been killing people before her existence had even been a thought. Interesting. Even the deep baritone of his voice commanded attention. It perfectly matched the man it belonged to. Most men would simply run, yet you stay. No allegiance to tie you here, no flag to rally under. He fully turned his body to her, one arm casually tucked inside his kimono top, as if he was completely unconcerned by Fu's presence. Why do you stand here, child, like an ant staring against a mountain, hopelessly daunted and yet unwavering? Fu grit her teeth in annoyance. She had been abused and controlled all her life as the people around her turned her into a perfect weapon. At one time in her life, it had been her only reason for living. Naruto had changed all that, but she wouldn't allow anybody to invalidate her being like that. I am not intimidated by you, we are the same, equals. There was a pause as the hulking man observed her curiously. She could see it in his gray eyes. He was weighing up whether she was even worth the effort. Finally, after a heart-wrenching silence, the man let out a bark of a laugh, a single sharp noise that cut through the still air and made Fu's eyes narrow. You are a Jinchuriki, I know this, but a powerful child is still just a child. Fu almost growled, but she managed to keep up her emotionless veneer. She wondered if he would be so confident saying that if it were Naruto standing before him and not her. She shook that from her mind though. It was no time to be doubting herself. She was strong enough to make the trust Naruto placed in her worth something. Do not be so ignorant as to consider us equals, child. That is neither Konoha nor Iwa. Fu took a calming breath as she tightened her stance, finding her focus before slowly allowing her orange eyes to drift up, locking with the man's steely gray ones. My name is Fu. The man tilted his head ever so slightly to one side before rolling it back, cracking his neck once. He didn't even bother moving into any kind of stance. He just stood there, like an unmovable wall of red steel, completely unconcerned. My name was Han once, but people like us, we are undeserving of such human names. Fu just frowned. That seemed like something she would say when she was back in Takigakure. I'm sorry if you feel that way. The man seemed momentarily confused by the sincerity in Fu's voice, although it was more of a sigh than anything else. However, he didn't have much time to think about as Fu took the opportunity to race forward, kicking up dust from the street with the speed she moved at. She wasn't like Naruto, able to talk people down from fighting. Besides, she could see this man harbored a deep hatred. What that hate was for was unclear, but what was clear was that Han wasn't here to talk. She thought she was fast. She had always been told she was fast, and until she met Naruto her speed had been practically unmatched. Since then, she had learned many times there were many people out there who could match and surpass her own speed. However, she had learned to take that as a challenge, improving herself over and over again so she could close that gap. However, now her speed, as remarkable as it was, seemed to count for nothing as Han almost leisurely lifted his armored hand up to block her jab. Apparently, even when he seemed less focused, he was no less alert. She remained unperturbed, bouncing back on her feet before skirting around the larger man who offered up no kind of resistance or counterattack. She used the extra traction offered by the dusty ground to slip around the larger man, only to silently balk as she saw he was even more heavily armored around his back. What's more, the man seemed to have something built into his armor. Some kind of heavy-duty furnace that occasionally belched a thin, misty vapor that didn't look too inviting. Before she could look any more though, her eyes widened imperceptibly as she ducked back, briefly forgetting that she had moved around to attempt some kind of attack. It was just in time as a meaty and heavily armored fist swung just over her head, Han not having even looked around. However, that changed as the bulky man slowly turned to observe her, his eyes quirking up in moderate interest, or perhaps amusement. Fu didn't care either way, rushing forward again she this time fainted down, preemptively moving out the way of another high-speed, lethal swing. Han didn't even seem to be trying, it was almost like he was simply acting just to see how Fu reacted. He didn't seem disappointed as she suddenly shot off the ground, aiming a deadly jab right for the man's unprotected eyes. Her fist didn't make it very far before she found her forearm trapped between the heavyset man's armored hands. Before he could move any more, no doubt snapping her much thinner arms like twigs, she shifted her weight and pushed off the man's chest. He didn't seem too concerned, merely allowing his arms to cross over his thick chest again, staring at the younger Jinchuriki evenly. It quickly became apparent that Fu's normal speed would not be anywhere near enough to breach even the first layer of this man's defenses. It wasn't that he was faster, in fact with the heavy armor he wore Fu had the advantage in that department. It was just the fact that he had experience, he was able to predict her moves with ease and had the reflexes to match her. Do you not see how fruitless this is now? Fu merely narrowed her eyes at the almost lazy drawl in the man's voice. However, the fact remained he had a point, at her current level she did not have the power to defeat him. Then again, she had a way to increase her own level, the real question was whether he could do the same. Figuring that floundering around trying to defeat this man in vain would do nothing for her, so she dug deep inside herself, finding that hidden well of power, while a single eyebrow in the giant man's face rose. I assure you that will do you no good. Fu ignored him as a thick, noxious veil of red chakra slowly enveloped her form, at first like a bubbling layer of acid that danced about on her skin before it sharpened, forming into a crisp red coating about her skin. The details were all there, a translucent helmet formed out of the coat, 6 ominous slits that glowed a slightly deeper red. Finally, a single long spindly tail grew languidly from the toxic cloak, completing the visage of the Nanabai no Kabutamushi. She remained silent though, even as an intense rage bubbled up from deep within her, a rage that wasn't completely her own yet rode on her own feelings. It was all there, her mistreatment in Takigakure, the loathing of her fellow villagers, the resentment and the anger. She quashed it all, repressing it down and controlling it until it was a barely noticeable red flicker in the back of her mind. It was something she had done hundreds of times before, ignoring the anger and hiding it behind a mask of complete indifference, killing her emotions as much as possible. This all happened in less than a second, yet the world moved in startling clarity for her, like everything was going slower. She knew she didn't have very long in the form, she could hold up a single-tailed state for a maximum of 30 minutes, each subsequent tail cutting that figure in half. Already she could feel the familiar tingle on her skin, a light burning sensation that she was just about able to ignore. She moved before the cloak was even fully settled, this time not just kicking up dust, but the ground itself as the sheer pressure of her chakra-enhanced footstep pushed the earth away. Despite his words before, Han did indeed seem to struggle against the newly empowered Fu. He started shifting his stance, resembling more of a taijutsu style. However, despite the power-up and the strength and speed offered by her Bijuu's double-edged chakra, she didn't seem to make any progress in getting past the armored man's defenses. For every glancing blow she managed to get through his guard that merely skirted off the thick armor, he returned the favor. The damage he did was negligible, the heavy blows barely phasing the thick chakra cloak. However, it couldn't last. Just when she thought she had begun to work out his pattern, going in for a blow that would have struck him right in the middle of the chest after getting him off balance. However, she didn't count on the fact that Han was doing exactly the same thing to her. In a surprising bout of speed, the man ducked beneath her blow. The writhing chakra surrounding her arm tried to react, breaking away from her to claw at the man's head. However, the red giant predicted this as well, rolling beneath the translucent appendage before coming up with a powerful blow straight to her midsection. The pain was indescribable, even through her Bijuu's normally protective layer of chakras she felt every inch of that blow. Even in the brief second she could watch in startled amazement. It didn't make any sense. He had done nothing differently, the blow was the same, just striking her more directly. Then she saw it, a massive burst of steam exiting the man's elbow, projecting the fist forward at unimaginable speeds. As she felt her feet lift off the ground, her mind managed to connect the furnace on the man's back to the steam she could see emanating off of him. Then, she was flying. It was a short flight as the spindly tail retracted back into her cloak, instead replaced by two thin, insectoid wings as her chakra shroud became slightly less crisp. They immediately began to beat, becoming little more than a vaguely red blur as she hovered there in the air. Han seemed just a little surprised by this before his face hardened, his gray eyes narrowing in the shadows of his Tsujigasa. However, they immediately widened again as foot charged forward, much faster now that she was in the air, her element. He predirted her movement though, lashing out with a fist that should have caught the girl right in the throat. What he didn't expect was for his forearm to harmlessly pass through a faint red blur, steam rushing from his elbow to show the pressure behind the blow. He had compensated for the extra protection given by the two-tailed chakra cloak, but he had not accounted for just how fast the girl could move in the air. He swiveled to try and catch her, but she was like a dragonfly, flitting about and only just staying in the corner of his eye. Then he felt it, a light tap. He barely even felt it through the armor he wore, but it was there. Then again, another light tap. He might not have even registered it if his senses weren't alert due to the adrenaline pumping through his system. They continued this way for another minute, foot darting inside Han's guard long enough to probe his defenses, but not long enough to deal any significant damage. Luckily for her, Han actually seemed to be trying now, whirling around and trying to anticipate where the girl would come next. He would struggle though, Fu barely had control over her wings in flight. It was mostly the will of the nanobi that guided them, the instinct to fight enemies controlling her movements. It seemed Han had finally deigned to take her seriously though, as the furnace on his back suddenly began spewing copious amounts of his steam, bathing the area in a pure white mist. It quickly became apparent though that it was no ordinary steam, as Fu found her cloak receding around her, withdrawing back into her body like a snail reacting to salt. On instinct she immediately flew backwards, hovering what she assumed to be a safe distance outside the steam. She was proven wrong though when a red giant suddenly flew out of the shroud, moving far faster than somebody of that size had any right to. She dodged backwards, the man flying right over her. Just before he vanished back into the white shroud below though, she managed to spot the faint hint of red surrounding his body. It was fuzzy and obviously uncontrolled, but it seemed it was enough to give the man a drastic boost in speed and power. This was quickly evidenced when the man hit the ground. The surrounding buildings shook from the force of the impact as a great plume of sand was displaced into the air. Then everything went still, only the swirling of the steam below her, and no indication of where Han had gone. She couldn't go back into the steam or risk losing her bijou cloak, possibly the only thing that would keep her from being boiled alive. She also couldn't stay out here. Han must have known that her ability to keep the shroud was limited by time, and right now she probably only had around 10 minutes left. Then, as if her prayers were being answered by some higher power, she felt the temperature around her drop drastically. Almost immediately the steam in the air cooled, thinning out and dropping away for a thin layer of moisture on the sandy ground. Fu looked around and spotted Haku standing on an opposite building, his hands in a seal that was definitely not one of the standard 12, and a look of intense concentration on his face. Finally, once the shroud of steam had dwindled to just a thin white layer hovering just above the ground, he stopped, taking his hands out of the sign and leaning on his knees. The thin white tendrils of the no longer lethal mist separated to reveal the stoic figure of Han, still lightly shrouded in a hazy red cloak, his initial Jinchuriki stage. A moment later Haku appeared in a body flicker near to Fu, giving the mint-haired Jinchuriki a nod which she returned. The two of them turned to face Han again, muscles tense to move as a thicker, viler chakra began to flow over his body. Naruto appeared on the roof above the arena, the sand he had ridden there dropping away under his feet as he stared at the enormous purple barrier before him. It moved and flickered like flame, but was hazy enough to block most of what it contained, however, he couldn't see anything thanks to what appeared to be trees behind the barrier, enclosing the area inside in a thick forest. He approached the barrier, holding his hand up to the heatless flames, and just watching curiously as the strange surface rose up a little as if trying to lick at his palm. "Ha, good luck getting through here, you moron. This is a heavy-duty barrier. Try asking that ANBU over there." The blonde looked around at the dark-skinned boy in the inside corner of the barrier, holding up his hands in a seal that seemed to be sustaining the powerful purple cube. He then looked around at what appeared to be a pile of blackened ashes on the roof beside them, obviously the remains of the ANBU that had tried to protect his Hokage in vain. Naruto ignored this as best he could, instead holding up his hand at the barrier. It flickered brightly when he brought it nearer before dying away, unable to sustain itself without the necessary chakra. The boy in the corner widened his eyes as the barrier just flickered before dying away where Naruto stood. However, before the blonde could walk through the makeshift hole he had created, something blocked the way. With the hole grew a large gray coffin from the ground, almost in reaction to the barrier being foiled. The lid cracked open before clattering to the ground, only revealing darkness inside. "Naruto?" The blonde could only stare, a tear finding its way to his eye as he was met by a veil of purple hair. Shizuku. Chapter 51, Inferno 4. Shizuku. Naruto took an involuntary step back, his shikuju falling from his loosened grip as he stared at the very girl he had cried over, dying in his blood-stained arms. It was her, really her, the familiar dark blue chakra coursing through her body didn't lie to him, this was really Shizuku. Except it wasn't, he didn't need an all-powerful Dojutsu to see that. Lines and cracks crossed her pale skin and clothing, looking like she had been pieced together from the remains of some impossibly intricate porcelain doll. Her eyes too, instead of the normal bright vibrant eyes he remembered the girl possessing, her sclera were now a dark, sickly gray. "Naruto." The impossible girl smiled sadly at him, one of her arms lifting slightly towards him slightly before she seemed to think better of it, returning the limb to her side. She was exactly as he remembered seeing her last, even wearing the same clothing, camouflaged to match the dismal atmosphere of Mizu no Kuni. It was as if somebody had taken a snapshot of her last moments and reconstituted it before his very eyes. "Is it really you?" A faint smile traced her thin lips as Naruto found his face struggling to hide the flurry of emotions cascading through his being. "Your hair is longer, and you got taller." The blonde nearly cracked at that, even her voice was the same, containing that same quiet lilt that he had so enjoyed listening to when they spoke. "But your eyes, it really is you." Naruto took another step backwards, making a small frown crease Shizuku's cracked features. "Shizuku, how are you here? I don't understand." He was really struggling at this point to keep the tumultuous emotion he felt out of his voice, but he could help the small crack in his voice. "I saw you die." Shizuku's timid smile turned downwards as she instinctually put a hand up to her throat, sending a surge of memories through Naruto's mind filled with shades of scarlet and crimson sullying that same pale skin. I remember that." She seemed confused by it herself, suddenly looking up and around at her surroundings, her eyes widening in surprise at the sprawling village around her, filled with sand and various shinobi cocooned within it. "What is going on, Naruto? Where are we?" However, before Naruto could say anything, if he could have said anything at all in his shocked condition, a low and menacing chuckling sounded out across the stretch of rooftop. Naruto's eyes widened as something seemed to grow out of the very tiles behind Shizuku, although the violet seemed unable to turn and look, seemingly frozen in place by that voice. "Oh, come now, answering everything would ruin the fun, wouldn't it?" Before the blonde's very eyes, a tall, pale man with long dark hair emerged from the roof, his body slumped forward limply. He wore an outfit consisting of gray trousers and a dark brown shirt with an earthen tunic thrown over, held in place by a thick purple rope tied up into a bow-like knot at the back. He brought his head up, capturing the blonde with his piercing gaze with two golden eyes, slitted like a snake's. Two distinctive purple markings traced the edges of his nose and the corners of his eyes, furthering the resemblance to the reptiles he emulated. Although I suppose having you flounder around in the dark would only serve to amuse me for a short time. The man seemed genuinely thoughtful at that, looking up and to the side as he brushed a single finger against his chin contemplatively. Finally, a long, sadistic grin slowly spread across his pale features as he laid a thin white hand against Shizuku's shoulders. The girl was seemingly frozen in place, her discolored eyes opening wider at the touch. Yes, having you know would be so much more satisfying. His gaze once again fell on the blonde, golden eyes meeting rippled violet, as he leveled a playful, but still dangerous look at the younger monk. What are you talking about? Having this man appear had alleviated some of the shock at seeing Shizuku, and Naruto had managed to gather himself. However, something was nagging at the back of his mind, something he felt he was supposed to remember, but wouldn't quite come to him. Considering his near photographic memory, it was rather irritating. I suppose the question is just how much to say The man didn't seem to even be paying attention to Naruto, stuck in his own world as he contemplated whatever it was he was thinking. Well, how about this? He slid the pale hand he had rested on Shizuku's shoulder up her neck, trailing it through her long purple hair before resting atop her head, cupping his other hand under her chin. Do you like her? I brought her back especially for you, Naruto-kun. It took me ever so long to find the samples I had left of her DNA. His smirk became even more sickening as his long tongue slid from his mouth, licking across his lips in a way that made Shizuku cringe in his grip, somehow unable to move when this man held her. You're just lucky that I never throw out possibly useful samples, even for failed experiments. Naruto found his hands tightening into fists without him even realizing it as the man referred to Shizuku that way. Otherwise, I might have had to disturb that lovely monument you made for her, very touching by the way. His voice had all the sincerity of a snake, ruined even more by that ever-present smirk that split his face. How did you find that? Naruto was beginning to lose his control over his emotions. Seeing this man hold Shizuku like this, talk about her like this, it was too much for him. The man seemed pleased by the emotional outburst, his sickening smirk growing wider, as his eyes flashed with something unrecognizable. Oh, but you leave quite the trail, Naruto-kun, and I have agents everywhere, waiting to diligently report every scrap of useful information to me like the good little pets they are. Again, Naruto clenched his hands tighter, beginning to turn his knuckles white as this man casually dismissed the importance of all those human lives. Did you really think nobody would notice you? Did you think that the hero of Kirigakure would remain a secret forever? Nothing can hide from me, Naruto-kun, especially not somebody with eyes as remarkable as yours. Naruto could practically feel the man staring intently at his eyes, a predatory glint entering his own. But right now, that's beside the point. He began running his fingers through Shizuku's hair again, making the violet grimace from the feeling, and Naruto clench his fist even harder in anger and frustration. I asked if you liked her, if you appreciated all the effort I went to in order to bring her back. Am I not benevolent? His sickening smirk told otherwise as he casually gazed at the young blonde before him, unconsciously drawn to the ringed eyes set into the boy's skull. What do you mean, bring her back? What is this? The man just chuckled again darkly, his voice managing to reverberate around the area despite the fact they were outside. This, my young Naruto-kun, is the result of the Edo Tensei no Jutsu, a remnant of our dear Nidame Hokage that I completed. It pulls the very soul out of the pure world, locking it inside a corporeal form again, and puts them under my control. Naruto fought to rein in his anger at that. The very idea of what this man was spouting was sickening to the boy. However, his eyes widened slightly as he felt a pang of hypocrisy run through him. Was that not the very same thing he did to Haku? However, there is the small matter of it requiring living human sacrifices to use as vessels, but for immortal soldiers with infinite chakra, I think it is merely a small price to pay. At that, Naruto almost breathed a sigh of relief. No, he was nothing like this man, able to so callously throw away human lives. So that is your intention, you brought back Shizuku to fight me? Naruto frowned at his own words. The thought of seriously fighting Shizuku almost made him feel ill. To see her die once had been a crippling blow to him, to actually repeat that, but at his own hands was just unthinkable. Even so, when it came down to it, he was more powerful than Shizuku. Even before she had died, he had only grown in strength since then. However, Orochimaru just grinned excitedly. He did so enjoy these conversations, when he could truly crush the hope inside of somebody. Oh no, of course not. Sensei and the Kazekage are fighting the reanimations of the Shoudame and Nidame Hokage as we speak. However, they are merely mindless drones, fit only to be tools to accomplish what I want. The man slid a kunai out of the pouch on his leg slowly, a paper talisman hanging from the end of the hilt as Naruto's eyes widened in realization. However, for you that just wouldn't do, having you fight a mindless puppet would serve no use. Another sinister smirk cut across the man's expression, as he idly spun the kunai by the ring on the hilt. Not to mention it wouldn't be nearly as entertaining. Before Naruto could even move, he suddenly plunged the kunai, the whole thing, straight into the back of Shizuku's head. Orochimaru. The Sanin's eyes widened in a small amount of surprise as the boy cried out his name just as he pulled his hand back out of Shizuku's head. Ah, you finally figured it out. I suppose the rumors I've been getting about you traveling with my dear teammate are true then. Tell me, how is Tsunade Heim doing these days? Still deathly afraid of any kind of responsibility, I suppose? However, no answer came from the blonde. He was transfixed, watching in morbid fascination as the many cracks and lines across Shizuku's body began to close. The color returned to her skin slightly, and small bright spark entered her eyes once more, something he remembered so vividly from their time together. Oh well, I suppose I can get my answers another time in Naruto-kun? The sickly sweet voice finally snapped Naruto out of his daze as his eyes widened in anger, his fists trembling by his side. You bastard! In flash a long, but more importantly sharp, black rod had slid out of Naruto's baggy sleeve, instinctively being caught in his hand at the exact same moment his other was raised, pointed at Orochimaru with the palm wide open. Banzho Tenin. Orochimaru's eyes opened wider slightly as he suddenly found his feet lifting off the ground and his body flying through the air. There was a sickening squelch as the Sanin's body roughly impacted with Naruto's, his head over the smaller blonde's shoulder. My, aren't you just full of surprises? Naruto's eyes opened wider as the Sanin's voice rang clearly from right by his ear. He could feel the chakra rod embedded in the man's heart. That was why he could tell this was not the real Orochimaru. Sure enough, a moment later the color on the man's body began to change into a uniform brown as the earth-natured shadow clone began to disperse. However, before he was gone entirely, the dissolving clone managed to turn, capturing the blonde's gaze with his now dulled, brown eyes. Enjoy this now, Naruto-kun. You will seek me out eventually, one way or another. Then he was gone, devolving into nothing more than a brown puddle on the tiles of the roof. Seconds later he wasn't even that, blowing away as nothing more than dust on the wind. The blonde just stared at the spot for a moment, shocked at what had just happened. He didn't get long through as his senses warned him of danger. Suiton, Bakusui Shoha. Naruto managed to dive for his dropped Shikuju just in time to launch himself off the ground and up into the air. His eyes widening, an enormous wave of water washed underneath him, the force of which was enough to completely crush the buildings behind the stadium and leaving a thin layer of moisture on the ground. He wasn't given any respite when he landed back onto the ground, instinctively bringing his hands up in front of himself. Suiton, Teppadama. Shinra Tensei. The tremendous wall of force he created was just in time to catch the powerful bullet of water, twice the size of Naruto himself. He could literally see the force of the gravity shockwave ripple across the sphere's surface before it harmlessly fell to the ground, its momentum lost. When it did, Naruto was able to see Shizuka standing behind it, her hands still locked in the snake seal, and an incredulous look on her face. Shizuku? The violet seemingly snapped out of her shock, looking up at Naruto with wide eyes before her hands began moving rapidly again, finally stopping on the bird seal. Naruto, watch out! Suiton Daibakufa no Jutsu. All around Shizuku water began rising into the air, from the liquid on the ground to the very moisture in the air, it began to coalesce above her at an astonishing rate. Then, all at once, an enormous vortex of water shot up into the sky before turning sharply right above Naruto, a veritable waterfall of roaring water. This time Naruto stood his ground more calmly, raising his hand up slowly as an invisible wall of force rippled from his body. The jutsu stood no chance, harmlessly dissipating against the indomitable force of Naruto's technique, not even leaving so much as a light spray to fall on him. All the while his eyes never left Shizuku's panicking form. "I can't control my body, Naruto. It's moving on its own." Even as she spoke, her hands were racing through seals that she didn't want to perform. It was like she was only there in consciousness, a mere passenger in her own body, watching helplessly as she attacked the person she cared about more than anything in the world. It didn't matter to her that none of her attacks were getting through. She had the same revulsion to hurting Naruto as he had to her. "Suiton, Dai Tai Huden." Her hands briefly paused on the tiger seal before she brought them both out in front of her, palms out. Her eyes widened in shock when Naruto did nothing to move out the way of her attack, even as thick streams of water began to grow from the moisture in the air, violently circling her small body. She was still getting used to just how powerful her attacks seemed to be all of a sudden. Back when she was still learning in Mizu no Kuni, even this much would have tired her out by now, not to mention she had never managed attacks of this magnitude. Now all of a sudden it felt as though her chakra supplies were infinite and each jutsu put hardly any stress on her body. At the last second, as the streams rotating around her body all came together in one enormous river that used her hands as a focal point to condense and concentrate, Naruto raised a single hand. The expected wave of force never came though. Instead, sand from the ground and the surrounding rooftops suddenly leapt forward as if each grain was suspended from some invisible wire at Naruto's beck and call. Faster than Shizuku's jutsu could reach him, it formed a tightly packed, half-dome-shaped wall in front of him. Almost instantly the compacted sand began to turn to a much darker sludge against the onslaught of the powerful water technique. However, that only made it heavier and more difficult to control. With Shikaku's cooperation, Naruto was quite easily able to hold his shield together. More surprising though was when the entire structure began to move forward, changing shape to better resemble a plow. Instead of simply absorbing the water, now it redirected it, up and out of any harm's way, sliding off the sand like it was metal. Finally, Shizuku's jutsu ended, unable to be sustained any longer as her chakra capacity completely ran out. Her reserves might have been endless, but there was still a limit to how much she could use at once. The sand immediately rushed forward, pulling up fresher, still dry sand from the surrounding area as it lurched out, wrapping around Shizuku in a loose dome. Naruto caught one last look at Shizuku's face, at her silent expression of relief, before the dome collapsed, spinning around and cocooning the girl within almost a foot of the chakra-reinforced earth. Naruto stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, not out of exhaustion or even exertion, simply because of the shock of what he just did. It didn't last very long though. Seconds later, a small patch of the sand cocooning his lost friend turned darker, and moments after that a small stream of water trickled out, pooling in one spot. A head of purple hair formed first as her body slowly began to rise up, reforming itself from the surrounding moisture. In only seconds Shizuku stood there again, unharmed and fully reconstituted, that same saddened expression marring her cute face. Naruto almost cursed himself for forgetting Shizuku's hydrification technique. However, he had never seen her use it to this extent before. It seemed that whatever this Edo Tensei jutsu did to control her also made her abilities work to their fullest extent. Naruto, please." She looked up at him, her altered eyes catching his own in a pleading expression as her hands began to twitch upwards. Her body was already reacting to the fact it was free, preparing itself for the next attack. "You have to fight back." Tears began to stream down her pale cheeks as she fought the control this jutsu had over her as best as possible, her hands still itching to move into hand seals. Naruto just stood there unmoving as his body struggled to catch up to his racing thoughts, desperately trying to think of a way to capture Shizuku without harming her. "Shizuku, I can't." The violet's head dropped slightly, causing a few bangs of hair to fall messily across her face. It made Naruto's heart ache to see it, as he remembered many occasions when they were talking when he would instinctually reach across to brush her hair back over her ear. When she finally looked back up again, a faint, sad smile ran across her lips, her darkened eyes expressing her resignation. "I know you don't want to, I don't either, but you have to." She finally stopped struggling against the invisible puppet strings guiding her body, allowing her hands to begin racing through seals again, stopping on the tiger seal right in front of her mouth. "So, I'll have to force you, Kirigakure no Jutsu." Her voice was barely a whisper, but the results were immediate. A thick rolling mist suddenly surrounded the pair. It stretched far off into the village as all the available moisture in the air and on the ground was concentrated and condensed into a thick, shroud-like fog. Naruto only faintly heard the sound of a sword being drawn from its sheath before silence swallowed him up. "You remember this, don't you?" Naruto turned to where he thought the voice came from, that same hint of sadness and regret telling him just who it was despite it being muffled. It seemed to reverberate through the mist, as if it came from every direction at once. The blonde frowned. He certainly did remember this, the day when Ao had introduced Shizuku to one of Kirigakure's most dangerous and feared techniques. That wasn't to say Shizuku had become a master of the silent killing technique by any means. She was far too kind-hearted for that. However, she had an advantage where others did not. Usually, a Kiri ninja wanting to learn the technique would have to dedicate months of intense and brutal training to completely extinguish the sound they made, rendering their opponent's senses useless in the scentless, sightless fog. However, thanks to Shizuku's unparalleled control over the water element, even in her untrained, unrefined state, she was able to thicken the mist to the point where it did the sound dampening for her. Of course, she only ever used it for knocking opponents out or leaving them for the other ninja. However, with her body being controlled as it was, Naruto didn't suspect she would be holding back anymore. "You seemed so unsure on the day Ao-sensei gave me a tanto. Even then I could tell you wanted nothing more than to shelter me, protect me." Her voice still echoed, making Naruto unable to trace where it came from. He caught the occasional flicker of a shadow that might have been her, but it was gone before he could turn. "But I wanted so much just to be useful to you, to do something you could be proud of me for." Even through the muffling of the mist, Naruto could hear the slight catch in her voice, the faint sob that a year ago would have had him rushing to see what was wrong. "I was always proud of you." It was out of his mouth before he could realize what he had done. A second later he just managed to catch a flash of silver out the corner of his eye before he dodged to the left. He caught the slight whine of a blade slicing through the air far too close to his ear before it was gone, back into the oppressive mist. The worst part was that he couldn't even use Yugura's technique in here. Shizuku's control over her element was even stronger than his. If he recklessly used his Deva path, he could risk hurting her, as he had no idea where she was. "You have to fight back, Naruto. If you don't, then I won't stop. This body will not stop." Naruto grit his teeth as Shizuku's voice called out again, his grip tightening around his shikuju. "I can't." His eyes widened again marginally as he was once again forced to move to the side, aiding his movements with a burst of wind chakra for speed. Once again, the flash of a blade passed close to his body. However, this time the terrible screech of metal on metal shrieked out inside the mist. Naruto looked down at his arm in surprise, not having even realized he had activated his Azura path. There was a light scratch there that was already beginning to fix itself. He grimaced at the cold feeling he always got when using this aspect of his abilities before his eyes opened wider in realization. "Naruto, please, this is the only way." His head whipped around. Shizuku's voice was now becoming desperate as she realized just how close she had gotten to hurting Naruto. The blonde, however, remained calm, rising up a little and focusing on his breathing, his Rinnegan straining to see anything but the chakra saturating the air. "No. It isn't." This time he made no move to react, even as he felt the flash of steel draw closer. However, Shizuku's blade didn't hesitate in the slightest, singing as it sliced through the air. There was a moment when her discolored eyes opened wider in shock before Naruto moved like lightning, literally. Sparks of electricity briefly danced over his body, enhancing his muscles' reflexes and supercharging his synapses for a brief second. It was all he needed. In a flash of movement he turned, holding a palm out, and Shizuku winced, expecting to feel the heavy impact of unrestrained gravitational forces. However, it never came. When she opened her eyes again, they widened in abject shock. Naruto was just standing there, her blade driven up to the hilt through his hand. Strangely, there was no blood, nothing to indicate he even had a wound at all. However, Shizuku failed to notice this in her shock. Almost immediately her controlled body attempted to remove her tanto from its impromptu sheath. It was fruitless though, as Naruto curled his hand around the blade, grimacing from the uncomfortable feeling. It wasn't actually too bad, the pain was more like a dull throb, more to indicate that he had actually been hurt than for the feeling itself. It was a strange, discomforting sensation that his own body wasn't quite his, as if he were merely moving unconscious strings on some unbelievably complex puppet he controlled. He hated using it, doing so felt like he had lost his arm, or whatever body part he was controlling with the Azura path at that particular moment. However, right now it was necessary, and that was what was important. Naruto. Shizuku's faltering voice and widened eyes betrayed her shock, even as her arm continued to uselessly pull at the sword, her body not quite realizing it was stuck yet. Naruto ignored the strange feelings from his arm as he looked up, meeting the not-quite eyes of the girl he had watched bleed out in his own arms. As much as he wanted to try and stay emotionless, to keep his own thoughts and feelings out of this, to do what he knew he had to do, he just couldn't. His expression softened as the smallest of smiles peeked at the edges of his mouth. Shizuku, I missed you so much. The girl's eyes trembled slightly as her mouth struggled to form words that wouldn't come. Here she was, standing before the boy who had saved her all that time ago, finally able to say the things she couldn't, and she still couldn't. Her head drooped down, her hair falling across her face and shadowing her eyes even as she felt the first teardrops begin to percolate on the edges of her vision. Please Naruto, kill me. Naruto's eyes widened, but only for a moment before his expression once again settled into a soft smile, his own head lilting slightly down. You know I can't do that, Shizuku. The girl's head shot up, tears now freely streaming down her porcelain cheeks, making a few strands of her hair stick messily to her face. Then what? You have to do something, Naruto, or I'll be forced to kill you. Her voice became quiet as her whole body shook slightly, even as her one arm continued to fruitlessly pull at her tanto. I don't want this. This existence is horrible. If you don't kill me, then I'm stuck like this, fighting whoever that man tells me to kill. Killing me now would be merciful compared to that. She stopped trembling though as Naruto looked up at her, his expression warm and inviting in a way she remembered so vividly. While an entire year had passed for the monk, it was only yesterday Shizuku was staring up at him through increasingly blurry vision, wiping away that solitary tear. What if I could bring you back, for real? The girl blinked in surprise, staring at Naruto, unable to comprehend what he was saying. However, the monk's face seemed completely serious. I did it for Haku, I can do it for you too, I'm sure of it. I just dashed. Naruto's eyes widened when he felt Shizuku's finger press up against his lip, noting that the limb was shaking, obviously taking a great deal of her will simply to do that much. Please Naruto, let me go. Naruto took an involuntary gulp as he stared at the girl before him, blinking away his shock. But she pressed her finger a little harder, halting what he might have said again, as she looked up at him imploringly, her wide watery eyes like a deep well that Naruto couldn't tear his gaze from. Please Naruto, just let me go. I don't belong here anymore, my time passed. She looked down again, her hand falling away as she lost the control to hold it there. My time to do the things I wanted was then, it's gone now. I will always regret the things I could never say. She looked up at Naruto again, her eyes tearing up as her hand began to struggle more violently against the solid grip the blonde had on her sword, but regrets are for the living. Please Naruto, let me go. Naruto began to feel tears form at the edges of his own eyes, but he blinked them back. But I couldn't save you. Shizuku gave him a watery smile as she managed to get a hand back up to his cheek, trembling from the effort it took to fight the jutsu controlling her body. Gently she wiped at Naruto's eyes, choking out a short, hollow laugh as she caught one of his tears before it could fall. Maybe you weren't supposed to. Slowly, with a great deal of effort she moved her hand down to Naruto's, grasping his wrist in a loose hold and guiding it back up until it rested just above her chest. "Please, just do what you can, set me free." It was Naruto's turn to tremble as he felt the girl's slow, rhythmic heartbeat below his hand. It felt so real, so alive. "Shizuku." The girl's eyes widened slightly as she felt her sword begin to give, sliding noisily with a sickening shriek against the metal of Naruto's skin. "Please Naruto, you have to do it now." Naruto just trembled, his hand flexing indecisively against Shizuku's chest even as the sword pulled back even more. He looked up, trying desperately to smile, to project the warmth he so frantically wanted to convey, but it was weak and stained with the beginnings of tears. "I'll never be able to let you go." Shizuku froze for a second, even the arm pulling at her sword paused momentarily as she looked around, the air becoming utterly calm for that exact moment. Finally, she smiled, genuinely, her lips crinkling up in a way Naruto remembered well. He used to relish that smile, work for it each day he kept Shizuku safe. "Thank you." Then it was gone. Naruto pulled back his hand, and with it the ethereal white form of Shizuku's soul, tearing it right out of her body with the sickening noise of ripping fabric. He held it there for a few moments, frozen in place as he felt the silk-like being swayed gently in his hand, the frozen form of Shizuku before him already beginning to dissipate into an ashen substance. Then, as both blew away in the breeze, one returning to the earth it was torn from, the other floating away back into the sky it belonged to. The blonde stood there, unable to move even as the heavy mist around him began to disperse, the chakra sustaining it gone now. He faintly remembered Shizuku's last dying words to him, but this time he paid them no heed. Tears freely flowed down his face as he fell forward, collapsing to his knees as he released all his sorrow, all his frustration and pain out in those small droplets of liquid. It felt good, unbelievably so, to cry out all the anguish he felt, letting it all wash away in the streams traveling down his face. Finally, he stood, a little shakily, but keeping his feet firm, wiping at his face to remove the last of his tears. Slowly he turned to the bright purple barrier, that was just now becoming visible through the fading mist, his features setting into a cold mask. His hands tightened momentarily around his shikuju before he started to walk, his eyes burning with something indeterminable. Deep in his mind he could feel her memories, her feelings. When he touched her soul he took more than her life, he took her essence. Shizuku would always be with him, everything that made her who she was would always be there in the back of his mind, driving him forward, reassuring him. Right now, though he had to put that aside as he strode forward, not even slowing down as he passed straight through the burning barrier. He had only one goal in mind now, and everything felt so crystal clear to him. He faced the forest of wood inside the barrier with cold, steely eyes as he raised a single hand, feeling the flood of chakra rush through his form as it swelled into a brilliant crescendo in his palm. Shinra Tensei. Chapter 52, Inferno V. Hiruzen was forced to throw his creaky, aging body to the side once again as an enormous blast of water that hadn't been there a few moments ago roared through the spot he had been standing in just a moment ago. This had been the common theme for the past few minutes, dodging one attack or the next from his former sensei and his brother. However, Hiruzen, aside perhaps Hamura or Koharu, knew his sensei better than anybody else, and it was easy to tell that whatever it was that Orochimaru had done to remove their personalities was affecting their combat abilities as well. It was either that, or with their personalities suppressed Orochimaru had to rely on information about their abilities. Hiruzen could be so lucky though, if the Shodaime were allowed to enter his sage mode or the Nidaime began using his early version of the Hirashin he knew he wouldn't have anything left to give. The Sandaime Hokage might have been called the god of shinobi, but he knew his predecessors were his superiors in most ways. The sheer raw power of the Shodaime just couldn't be surpassed, and the Nidaime's skill and tactical planning were the stuff of legends. Even in his prime, when the other four Kage had feared seeing him on the battlefield, he was sure this would have been a tough and ultimately downhill battle. Even now he feared Jiraiya would be quite easily able to defeat him, especially if the boy managed to get time to enter his own sage mode. The man sighed wearily as he used the adamantine staff, his most prized possession and dearest companion, to skillfully vault up and away from a set of growing branches that would have otherwise ensnared him. Sparing a quick glance across, he caught a flash of gold as a devastating earth-style attack was blocked by a near-impenetrable shield of gold dust. He had to admit that the Yondaime Kage was a man worthy of the title, able to use his unique Jiten abilities with surprising skill and creativity to match the Sandaime Tsuchikage blow for blow. However, the aging Hokage knew it was only a matter of time before the legendary fence-sitter began using some of his more feared techniques, namely the Jinton, dust release. Hiruzen had never seen the legendary Kekei Tuta before, however he had heard stories of it from his sensei, the very same man he was attempting to fight right now. On that note, he was once again forced to throw his tired bones out of the way of yet another potentially crippling deluge of water. The sheer speed and volume the man was able to draw from the atmosphere alone was just phenomenal. However, this time the elderly Sarutobi was prepared, using his bow staff to catch onto a nearby branch, flicking himself up and onto the sturdy bough, already racing through well-worn hand seals. Doton, Doryutaiga. He didn't stop on his final hand seal though, even as a molten wave of mud began flowing out from him, quickly cannibalizing the surrounding tiles. Already he was layering his chakra, layering it over and over inside of himself as he rapidly converted its nature from the slow-moving, heavy earth into something lighter, more volatile, and far hotter. Katon, Karyoenden. His hands finally paused on the tiger deal, aching from the speed he had to move through the various signs. He took a deep breath, kneading and fanning his chakra, until it was a veritable inferno before releasing it all in one great breath. It came out as a white-hot, intense stream of flame, like a true dragon's breath, roaring over the mudslide he had created. The normally slow-moving, sluggish mud was set aflame, broiling under the heat of the fire technique until a river or burning, molten tar was racing towards the two resurrected Kage. This was what had made him famous, made him feared for simply being, his ability to create collaboration jutsu entirely on his own. The Nidaime Hokage tried to react by conjuring water as a defense, however the dry, arid air caused by the burning tar offered little for him to take. His defense was nothing compared to what it could have been had the Edo Tensei not held him back and his reincarnated body suffered for it, immediately catching alight as the tar finally reached him. Hiruzen barely paused to watch, still unable to see his former sensei suffer through this. Unluckily for him, the showdown had more time to prepare, quickly creating a large dome-like barrier of wood. That same barrier had once managed to halt a Bijudama in its tracks and, even weakened as it was by the control Orochimaru had placed over him, Hiruzen's collaboration jutsu stood no chance. However, it did buy him time, allowing him to briefly hunch over, breathing heavily as he rested his hands on his knees. His partner seemed to take notice of this as a large silver-haired monkey seemingly grew from the end of the adamantine staff. "What are you doing, Hiruzen? You know now that you are far too old to be using these jutsu and collaborations so recklessly, your body just can't take the strain." The elderly Hokage offered up a tired smile as he pulled himself back up, straightening into the proud image of what a Hokage should look like. "Come now, Enma, I've known many a shinobi able to fight well past my age. The king of the monkey contract huffed irritably, arms crossing over his muscled chest, as his eyes showed the lack of amusement he felt as he slowly watched his long-time friend kill himself. "Yes, and all of those were either Senju or Uzumaki, neither of which you are." Hiruzen just let out another weak laugh as he cracked his neck, really starting to feel the strain on his tired bones. He had really let himself get out of shape over the years of peace, however. He would gratefully allow himself to grow complacent in peace than keep his village suffering through the horrors of war. "Yes, that's true I suppose, but you shouldn't be worrying about me, old friend. Right now our best bet is to help the Kazekage. His gold dust is our only chance of subduing the two Hokage long enough for me to deal with Orochimaru and hopefully end this horrific defilement of my sensei and his brother." Hiruzen looked grim as he saw the Nidaime begin to regenerate, his ashen body reforming from seemingly nothing. "Otherwise, I fear I will be forced to use the jutsu." Enma widened his eyes as he looked the old man he had fought beside so long. He was about to argue, but he managed to catch a glimpse of something, a steel in the old man's eyes that hadn't been there in many years. Finally, the boss summon of the monkey clan let out a gruff snort as he began to fade back into his staff form. In any case, it had been an honor fighting alongside you again, my old friend. Hiruzen's features softened for just a moment as his hands tightened slightly about his weapon. He was far too old for this fighting business, but that didn't mean he wouldn't die a warrior's death to save his village. Likewise. He got no response from the staff as he settled back into his bujutsu stance, feeling every creak in his old body. However, before anybody could react, and before Hiruzen had even managed to gather his breath, the ground suddenly rumbled beneath their feet. Floor tiles were shaken loose as a few of the weakened branches from the showdame's expansive forest fell from their oddly angled trees. Everybody managed to look around in the apparent direction of the force before having to shield their eyes as a good section of the chakra-fueled forest they had been fighting in was suddenly blasted inwards. Bark and wood were scattered across the area as dangerous shrapnel causing all but the reanimated Hokage to shield themselves. Hiruzen managed to bat the worst of it off with the adamantine staff, while the Kage formed a quick shield from his gold dust, unintentionally shielding Oanoki at the same time. Finally, Orochimaru sank into the ground, allowing the bits of sharpened wood to paw harmlessly over the spot he had just been standing in. His eyes narrowed as he realized just what was happening. Everybody was forced to keep a hand over their eyes for just a moment as they looked at the bright, gaping hole in the foliage after fighting in the darkened conditions for so long. However, in that brief instance their eyes widened at the sight of a man's silhouette, his cloak billowing lazily behind him as he held his shakuja firmly in one hand. However, that didn't capture their attention, nor did the horns seemingly rising from the man's forehead. It was his eyes. In that brief moment, when only his outline could be seen, everybody managed to catch a glimpse of those violet, ringed eyes, burning with a cold, dispassionate glare. However, the moment passed as the skilled shinobi's eyes managed to adjust to the new light abnormally quickly, a testament to the strain they had to put on their bodies over the years. In the place of the imposing figure, shrouded by darkness and casting a dangerous glow with his legendary eyes, stood a young teenage boy with messy blonde hair. Hiruzen's eyes opened wider as he caught sight of the boy, even if his whisker marks had somehow vanished and his eyes had changed from the cerulean blue he remembered so fondly. There was no mistaking the child standing in front of him, intruding on a battle between Kage like some divine intervention. Naruto? The boy's gaze, already far too old and stern for his youthful appearance, momentarily softened as he caught sight of the man that had acted like a grandfather to him in his childhood. Aside from the Ichiraku family, he had been the one little ray of happiness he was allowed to experience in his otherwise isolated and bereft life. Hey Gigi, it's been a while. Fo had to breathe a fast sigh of relief as she managed just barely to flit back from where Han's meaty fist would have otherwise caved in the side of her head. With him now entering his tailed state, even if the cloak wasn't quite as well defined as Fo's was, the gap between their speeds and power was beginning to drop again. Even this time she only just managed to dodge thanks to the thin layer of ice coating the ground, making Han's footing less stable while doing nothing to affect the speed Fo could fly at. She would have to thank Haku after all was said and done, although she had to reconsider that too if they made it out of here alive. As Han got up, his rage beginning to show on his face as another tail sprouted from his own cloak. Fo was already up to her three-tail state, and the strain was beginning to make itself apparent, even if for some reason it didn't seem as bad as it used to be. The tingle on her skin had become an irritating burn, and it was becoming more and more difficult to withhold all the negative emotions that might cloud her judgment. She caught a flash of light out of the corner of her eye as a storm of ice Sinbon flew through the air towards Han, a panting Haku on the other end of them. The large Jinchuriki almost paid them no mind, only offering up a token hand to swat them away. The ice, hardened as it was by Haku's impressive chakra control, was still no match for the virulent, burning chakra that surrounded Han. Right now, all Haku could do was act as somewhat of a distraction, but already he looked to be feeling the drain on his reserves, his movements slowing and his attacks becoming less refined. However, it was enough for the moment as Fo's third tail flicked once to the side. She used the opportunity Haku had given her to dart forward, ignoring the pain across her body from where Han had managed to catch her a few times with those pressurized punches. She poured all her speed in, knowing that her time in this form was already running out. Soon she would be running on little more than vapors and Han would be easily able to finish the two weary combatants off. Haku's distraction did its job though, keeping Han's attention long enough for Fu to get in close. The red giant rocked back as the bijou-backed blow struck him clean across the face, not having been able to react in time to meet the oncoming threat. However, the cloak around his body had no such restraints. As Fu's wings angled themselves to take her away from the armored behemoth, the two bubbling red tails shot out at her, attempting to enthrall her in their burning embrace. They were only partially successful. Fu only had one tail to effectively fight with, the other two used for flight, so she managed to fend one of them off. However, the other managed to wrap around her arm. She winced slightly as she felt the malicious chakra constrict around her limb before twitching violently, flicking out and away from Han as it sent the mint-haired Jinchuriki flying across the street. Unable to right herself in time, she crashed straight through a sturdy wall, impacting with two more before finally stopping in the crater of a third. With somewhat of a struggle, she managed to pull herself out limb by limb before collapsing ungracefully to the ground. Her cloak had taken most of the impact for her, but being thrown through two different buildings hurt, no matter how protected you were. With a groan though, she managed to pick herself up, still repressing the pain on her skin as it slowly blistered beneath the foul chakra she wore. Her two tails buzzed experimentally once before picking her off the ground, just in time too, as immediately after she was able to flit to the side, avoiding as Han's two tails came crashing down through the ceiling, the giant following soon after. She flew straight past him, flying up and out of the hole he had made in the roof, continually dodging as he continued to send his tails after her. Once she was a safe distance above the raging giant, she took stock of the situation, panting heavily from the exertion. It was no use right now. Fu's superior power and speed weren't enough to bridge the gap between the two Jinchuriki's respective experiences. Han was able to throw her around like the bug her bijou emulated and didn't even seem to be breaking a sweat over it. What Fu needed was to seriously increase the gap between their powers. However, she just didn't have the time, or better said, Han wouldn't give her the time. However, as if he were reading her thoughts, Haku suddenly appeared on the roof of the nearly collapsed building in a rapid shunshin. As Han picked himself up from his devastating drop, Haku was already racing through hand seals. However, even Fu could see the exhaustion in the boy. It was evident in the way his hands moved more sluggishly than normal, in the way his posture wasn't quite as correct as he usually held himself. He was in a battle between Jinchuriki, one of pure power and stamina, and he just didn't have the endurance to keep up. Even Fu could see he was running on less than fumes, and yet he continued to try. Finally, he reached the end of his inordinately long string of hand signs, holding the last one for a moment as he blinked away his exhaustion before slamming both of his hands down on the roof of the shattered building. Ice began to spread out from the contact, quickly coating the ground like winter sped up. When it reached the gaping hole in the roof, it just kept going, spreading across the gap as a thick, translucent plate of ice. Almost immediately one of Han's tails struck out at the new obstacle. However, much to Fu's surprise, the chakra-reinforced ice held, if only just. A long, dangerous crack spread out from the point of impact, yet it was already beginning to heal over. Han seemed to notice this as well, repeatedly bashing at the surprisingly sturdy ice. However strong as it was, it couldn't stand up to a repeat beating from two chakra tails. Fu could already see Haku tiring under the strain of repeatedly fixing all those cracks. He wouldn't last much longer. The mint-haired Jinchuriki wasn't about to let his effort be in vain though. Already she was reaching inside herself, feeling that vile, bubbling well of chakra that had been the bane of her existence for the first 11 years of her life. She pulled on it, taking as much as she dared as she cringed inwardly. Outwardly though the change was more apparent. Her cloak thickened, sprouting two more wings in rapid succession. All sense of definition was lost though, as the once crisp layer of red deformed into a bubbling, almost liquid mess. She just about had sense to hold back until the very last minute, until Haku's ice couldn't hold on any longer. It burned all her around her, excruciatingly so. Her skin felt like it was being repeatedly flayed, only to immediately heal to start the whole process again. Below her, Hans seemed to realize what was going on as his attack on the ice became more frantic, bashing away at it with his own bubbling tails. Finally, the ice cracked, and for once it didn't repair itself. Haku was finally spent, unable to continue. Fu's glowing orange eyes narrowed briefly as she tucked her wings in about her, already feeling the shift of the air currents as her body spun. Tsubasa no Kaiten. Her voice came out harsh, gravelly, as if distorted through some aged speaker, as she continued to spin, faster and faster until she was nothing more than a thin red blur in the sky. Then she dropped. Hans stood no chance as the unstoppable revolving mass of chakra barreled towards him, easily shattering the partially destroyed ice in the way without even slowing down. Smoke and dust erupted like a geyser from the point of collision, shrouding the streets outside until the enormous shockwave that immediately followed blew it all away. Finally, when it all cleared and Haku was able to take his hand away from his eyes and mouth, he was able to look down and see the deep crater Fu had created with her attack. It was oddly shaped, looking more like it had been drilled from the earth as opposed to simply gouged out like most impact craters. Right at the bottom though, at the center of all the spiraling damage, lay Han, his chest armor shattered and his breathing slow and shallow. Nearby Fu was staggering to her feet, not looking at all stable as she wobbled about, unable to find balance in her weakened state. Her body was riddled with burns from the vile chakra, as well as the far too rapid rotations of her own attack, and Haku was amazed she was still able to even stand. However, he was proven partially wrong when the girl collapsed to her knees again, using her hands to support herself as she knelt there, shuddering through the pain, unwilling to allow herself to fall to unconsciousness. Haku was by her side in an instant, supporting her shoulders despite being completely exhausted himself. Finally, the two managed to get into a somewhat comfortable sitting position, just breathing slowly as they tried to regain their lost energy. Fu wanted nothing more than to rush off and try to help Naruto, but in her current condition she would be useless to him. So, what do we do with him? Fu looked around, somewhat surprised as Haku's voice suddenly cut through the silence before looked across to where he was limply pointing at Han's unconscious body. She shrugged tiredly, barely able to think, never mind decide what to do with this hulking brute of a man she was fairly certain neither of them could lift. However, their decision seemed to be made for them as she saw a curious tendril of sand enter the destroyed building. It seemed to linger around them for a moment, as if looking at them, or perhaps sniffing them like a dog might, before quickly moving on. With it came more, and soon a small river of sand had entered the crater, slowly wrapping the unconscious Jinchuriki up in its grainy embrace until only Hans had remained. Fu simply sighed in relief, glad that her job seemed to be done now. It was like a small burden being lifted from her shoulders, and like that, she was gone. Haku watched with a small smile as Fu slumped over to the side, finally admitting her exhaustion and falling to it. He didn't though. He was tired, but not entirely gone. He had enough in him to at least watch over Fu and make sure nothing happened to her before Naruto was able to return to them. He was sure this would all be over soon. If it wasn't, then some of the stronger jounin would be given time to break free, and things would only get worse after that. Hiruzen found himself speechless as he stared at the young boy he hadn't seen for over 6 years. However, he didn't get long to gawk as Naruto reset his features, pulling something off of his belt as his gaze drifted over to where the Nidame had finished regenerating as the showdown was coming out of his wooden shield. He flooded chakra through the object, and once again Hiruzen was dumbfounded as the innocuous little jar suddenly expanded, quickly becoming an enormous stone pot, 3/4 the size of Naruto himself. He may not ever have set eyes on the Kahaku no Juhei, but he recognized it all the same. He was the professor after all, and the artifacts of the Sage of the Six Paths did not escape his notice. It wasn't every day that you saw a stone jar suddenly grow to 5 times its previous size, although the large kanji for lightning that was supposed to be there was conspicuously absent. Naruto suddenly placed a hand on the artifact, filling the pot to the brim with his chakra as he focused his cold, unwavering gaze on the two past Hokage. Hashirama and Tobirama Senju, Shodame and Nidame Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, first user of Mokuton and unparalleled Suiton user. Both reanimated Hokage looked around curiously at the young boy, however, as soon as their gaze met, their fates were sealed. Slowly, as if ink traveling through water in ripples, the two names appeared on the side of the amber purifying pot, ingraining themselves there as if burned onto the surface. Unfortunately, the two Hokage were not themselves. They did not see the danger the ancient artifact posed to them. However, they did react when Naruto began to run through a long chain of hand seals one-handed, still firmly keeping a grip on the pot to his side. They recognized the hostile action and reacted accordingly, both Hokage running through hand signs of their own. It was for naught though, as Naruto beat them to it, finishing his chain before they could theirs. Holding that one hand sign, his body practically boiling over with chakra, Naruto quickly pushed the lid of the Kahaku no Juhei. Both former Hokage froze in place, mid-hand seal, as a ferocious wind picked up throughout the artificial forest, pulling branches off of trees and sending loose shingles flying everywhere. Their bodies began to stretch out, distorting gruesomely as they were pulled towards the awaiting pot. Both Hokage tried to resist, the Nidaime by grabbing at the floor, and the Showdown by sending out wooden stakes from his hand, biting into the roof below them. However, it was in vain. Tobirama only found the tiles being pulled up under him, and Hashirama fared no better, as the roof he tried to secure himself to prove equally delicate under the harsh pull of the purifying pot. Finally, it was over. The two Hokage had been fully merged with the liquid inside the pot, and Naruto hurriedly slammed the lid back down, sealing them inside. The black kanji bearing their names flared white for just a moment before going dull, not fading away though. Naruto panted heavily for a moment before righting himself, taken by surprise at how stressful that whole sealing process had been. It felt like he was having a battle of wills between himself and the two reanimated Kage, and he wasn't sure if it would have gone his way had they been in full control of themselves. Naruto. He finally turned, offering up a small smile to his grandfather figure as the man stared at him, unsure of what to say. Hey Gigi, I guess what Naruto might have said was cut off as his senses went off, his eyes opening wider just in time to throw his hand up, palm up and facing over Hiruzen's shoulder. Shinra Tensei. He controlled the blast, narrowing down as much as he could. Even so, the Sandaime staggered back a bit as the very edges of the technique clipped his shoulder. He turned, shocked to see Orochimaru's limp body flying through the air away from him, having emerged from a tree with his deadly blade, the Kusanagi, held firmly in his mouth. The snake Sannin managed to flip gracefully and land on a tree horizontally, sticking there with chakra, as if he weren't standing on a vertical surface, and it was the most natural thing in the world. He stayed in a crouch, calmly observing his old mentor and the young blonde with his gleaming golden eyes, the lethal blade in his mouth retracting back down his throat gruesomely. "Ah, Naruto-kun, so nice of you to join us at last. I had expected Shizuku-chan to hold you up a little longer, at least until I killed Sensei here." He spoke with such casual nonchalance, a slight lilt in his voice that was at the same time enthralling and sickening, and a slight grimace of disgust momentarily found its way onto the young monk's face. "Orochimaru." The Sandaime's stern voice cut through the tension, apparently having recovered from seeing Naruto. "This fight is between you and me, leave anybody else out of this." The pale man tilted his head lazily until his eyes rested on his aging sensei, staring at him uncaringly as if he were simply observing some uninteresting research specimen. Now old man, I'll get to you in just a moment. Why don't you rest those tired bones of yours?" The Hokage's face twisted into a scowl as Orochimaru's mocking laugh echoed through the expansive forest atop the roof, making even the other two fighting Kage pause for a moment before their fight continued in earnest. Those same yellow eyes suddenly flicked over to Naruto, a sadistic grin sliding over the pale Sannin's face. "I must say, Naruto-kun, I had high hopes for you, but even when my clone dispersed, even I was slightly disbelieving. You really did a most wonderful job incapacitating the shinobi out there." He sniffed in, as if relishing the brief moment like some fine wine. "I could have only done a slightly better job of it myself. After all, they are all mere pawns, tools that had served their use in bringing me here to my dear sensei." Naruto scowled at that, just the way this man talked. No, simply the way this man existed was sickening to the senses. "You're nothing but a coward." Orochimaru's eyebrow quirked up in amusement as his studious gaze rolled over the blonde slowly. "Hiding behind men and women, giving them false promises, so you can lead them to their deaths just to further your own selfish goals, hiding behind immortal soldiers and psychological tricks instead of fighting yourself. My master told me it's better to choose a fight that will end in pain than force somebody to fight it for you out of fear." For a moment Orochimaru's soft, predatory gaze hardened into cruel, vicious glare before he caught himself, another lazy smile rolling across his features. "Ah, but Naruto-kun, how can it be you're calling me a coward? Don't you see? Running away from your village in the dead of night after murdering 2 shinobi? Is that not cowardice by your own definition?" Naruto's eyes widened before narrowing into a glare, his hand tightening around his staff. "Taking sanctuary with monks instead of owning up to your crimes? Facing your punishment?" His grip tightened again as he felt chakra burn and bubble inside his body. On the outer edge of the barrier the Sound Four widened their eyes in shock. "Orochimaru-sama?" The snake Sannin ignored his subordinate though, too intent on seeing just how much of a reaction he could get out of the Rinnegan bearer. "How about stealing property from Kyumo? Was it not cowardly to accept their hospitality for so long only to throw it back at them?" Naruto's eyes were now glowing faintly with a dull violet light as his glare intensified, his knuckles turning white from the pressure of his balled fist. "And how about Mizu no Kuni?" Orochimaru's predatory smirk became practically vicious as he leaned forward slightly, a sadistic gleam in his eye. "Orochimaru-sama?" Again, the subordinate went ignored, their cry falling on deaf ears as Orochimaru continued his monologue, his voice dripping with tainted honey. "Mizu no Kuni, where you allowed your friend to be mercilessly killed, unable to save her despite the overwhelming power you possess thanks to those marvelous eyes of yours." At this point Naruto was almost trembling with rage, his chakra excitedly churning through his body, just waiting to be released. "Orochimaru-sama." For a third time the desperate plea went unnoticed as Orochimaru and Naruto continued to stare at one another, their eyes locked together in an unbreakable bind. "Except you did you, Naruto-kun? You got your revenge, didn't you?" A light blue haze had begun to form around the blonde from the sheer pressure of the chakra he was holding back inside his body. How did it feel to see the light leave his eyes? To watch as your friend's murderer died at your hands? I bet it was exquisite. How are you any different than me? The glee in the Sannin's eyes was palpable as he watched the rage surface underneath the blonde's carefully controlled exterior. "Orochimaru-sama." Finally, the pale man's patience snapped as he turned angrily to the subordinate that had dared to interrupt him. "What is it, you insolent whelp? Didn't I tell you?" The Sannin trailed off, finally noticing the ominous shadow that had fallen over the rooftop along with the oppressive silence. All around them, surrounding the building on all sides, were enormous, impossible walls of sand, hovering just outside of the barrier. It was a desert's worth, just hanging there in the air, not even a grain falling loose with only the flaming purple barrier between it and all that lay inside. However, Orochimaru was under no illusions that the barrier would hold for very long against such a deluge of sand, reinforced even further with chakra as it was. "Ah." The hiss of annoyance in the snake Sannin's voice was somewhat satisfying to the blonde as he gazed up at the sight that would have lesser men shaking in fear. "It seems you played your hand quite skillfully, Naruto-kun." His gaze fell back on the young monk with that ever-present smirk still there, even if it was wavering towards a skull. "Make no mistake, boy, we will see each other again, you two, old man." Before anybody could react, the slimy man managed to bit his thumb, racing through seals impossibly fast before slamming his palm down. "Kuchiyos no jutsu." There was an enormous burst of smoke that completely filled the rooftop, and before it had even cleared, the massive snake Orochimaru had summoned had crashed through the sand, making a large enough hole for him to escape through as the barrier fell down around him. Naruto widened his eyes in surprise. It had all happened so fast even his sand couldn't react in time, One moment Orochimaru was there, the next he had managed to get away. Before Hiruzen could even call to him, he was off, chasing after the man through the very same hole he had made to escape. Even in his haste he had remembered to grab the Kahaku no Juhei, letting the artifact shrink down even as he ran. However, he had forgotten one thing. As soon as he emerged out into the village he extended his senses through the water in the air, immediately finding Orochimaru, running away from the village with his 4 subordinates. However, he also found Haku and Fu, their chakra dangerously low. The blonde froze there for a moment, his gaze flickering between Orochimaru's retreating form and his friends. Already he could feel some of the more powerful jounin breaking free of his sand, and he knew he didn't have much time, but at the same time he might never get another chance to go after Orochimaru. Oddly enough, it was Shizuku that made his decision for him, not literally, but at the same time he just knew that was what she would have done. That was all he needed, instantly sprinting off further into the village, away from Orochimaru and towards his friends. He would never allow somebody he cared about to be hurt again, not if he could stop it. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.